Good morning and a very warm welcome to the European Policy Centre Friday Update, our weekly look at the key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role and politics in general. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC and the regular moderator of this weekly update. Joining me this week as we look ahead to next week's EU summit, the first face-to-face meeting since the crisis began, that summit on the new EU budget and recovery plan proposals, and consider what impact the COVID-19 crisis has had on populism in Europe and on the vexed issue of how to ensure respect for the rule of law and the EU's fundamental values. Joining us are our special guest today. She'll be joining us in a moment, Heather Grabbe, who is director of the Open Society European Policy Institute, and she's a member of the EPC Strategic Council. And she will join us a bit later to discuss populism and the rule of law. Also with me, as always, Janis Emmanouilidis, the EPC's Director of Studies. Housekeeping before we start. As always, this is a totally interactive session based on questions from me to our speakers and then from all of you. As always, your microphones are muted. If you would like to ask a question later, click on the raise hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes and give you the floor. Or if you prefer to write your question, just click on the enter a question button. And could I, as always, please plead with you to keep your questions brief and to the point so I can see at a glance who the question is for and what it is you want to know. So let's get underway, and we're going to start just with a brief look ahead to next week's EU summit and what we can expect, and then we'll turn to that question of the rule of law and populism. So Janis, lots of speculation, lots of toing and froing, Angela Merkel warning it's going to be a tough road. What is your sense of the mood now about the chances that we get a deal at next week's summit?
Well, I think what you can first of all see is that a lot of things are happening. You have intensifying discussions in Coreper. You have a lot of behind the scenes exchanges between Michel and heads of state and government. You have bilateral exchanges. A lot of people meeting with Mark Rutte, knowing that he will be a difficult case at the final moments of these negotiations. So there is progress. While having said that, we still have a lot of unknowns, a lot of difficult cookies which need to be settled. So to make a prognosis as to whether things will be moving or whether we might even have a result at the European Council next week, Friday, Saturday, maybe even Sunday, there's even speculation that they might even move into Sunday, is a little bit premature. However, again, they need to have some progress. The question is whether they will have a final result or whether they will need a second round of drama with a second European Council meeting in the weeks afterwards.
And you mentioned the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. All roads lead to the Netherlands this week. He's seeming to be sticking pretty firm and making one very strong demand, which is saying all disbursements, decisions on the criteria for handing out money under the recovery programme and who precisely on who gets it should be for all member states unanimously. Is that a runner? Is that part of the landing zone, as it were? Are we beginning to see where a deal might emerge? And if he's insisting on, and he seems to be sticking very tight on this, others saying, no, that would politicise decisions on where the money goes. How do you see that playing out? Do we have any sense of where the likely landing zone is?
Difficult. Well, the issue related to conditionality and control, the two C's, I think is going to be a key issue, and especially the governance questions of how decisions will be taken. So now with Mark Rutte coming forward saying that unanimous decisions should be taken in the Council, and that is pushing the bar, I think, very high. In the beginning, the idea was that it would be the Commission and that it would require reverse qualified majority to stop decisions of the Commission. That couldn't have worked. Then we moved to the idea of having qualified majority voting in the Council. Now you have this unanimity idea on the table. But I don't think that this can work, because imagine that you would have to take decisions in the Council unanimously. One, that would make the process very, very slow. Taking decisions, we've seen that in the past, would be almost impossible. Second, it would provide veto powers to every player. So let's just imagine, we will be talking about populism and rule of law later on. If there are links to conditionality in the rule of law, and the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban says, well, if you want my okay for a certain decision in the council related to the recovery plan, there is a price to be paid. So I think it's also at the end of the day not in the interests of the frugals. But conditionality and control is only one aspect which is going to be on the table. There's still the question of the overall size of the plan, the balance between loans and grants, own resources, the duration, the payback, rebates. So a long list of issues that will be discussed, and there might even be surprises.
And of course, we're waiting. Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, due to publish his what they call the negotiating box, the latest proposal about now, in fact. So as you say, to that question of the overall size and that balance, in terms of the overall size, it seems that most of the debate is focusing on these conditionality questions much more than on the other issues at the moment. Is that because the size of it overall is becoming relatively less contentious?
I don't think so. I would still believe that the 750 billion size for the recovery plan is going to be something which will be on the table, especially when you start discussing the balance between loans and grants. So there might be changes there. Then there's the other part, which is related to the MFF and the overall size of the MFF. And here we have indications that President Michel will go for a slightly lower level of the MFF compared to what we had on the table in February. So it's both the overall size of the MFF, but then also especially the size of the recovery plan, recovery fund, and I think it's going to be all part of a package. So things could still be moving even in that with respect to this issue.
Okay, what happens? How significant is it if we don't get a deal next week? As you say, very hard to predict at this stage. A seeming intent to try hard, all these predictions of going into 2 days, maybe 3 days. But if we don't get a deal next week, is it disastrous? And if we don't get a deal, you talked about 2 rounds of drama. If we have another round of drama in late July and still don't get a deal, how serious is that? So the 2 stages, if you would, and then we'll move on.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that the expectations are now that the chances of getting a final deal at the upcoming European Council are not that high, which, by the way, is probably the best precondition if you actually want to get to a deal. So you set the bar lower. But if you don't get a final deal on the 17th, 18th, maybe even 19th, I don't think that that would be a disaster. The disaster would actually happen if you don't get a deal during the summer, because you actually need an agreement on the MFF and the recovery plan, and you need it quickly. And as we have alluded to also in past Friday updates, the situation during the autumn will not be better politically. I think you will see that numbers will go up in terms of unemployment. A good number of companies will go bust throughout the European Union and different member states, even in those who have been in relative terms done better with respect to fighting the economic consequences of COVID-19. So politically, to get a deal then might be even more difficult than getting it during the summer. Plus, if you don't get a deal during the summer, I think this will be poison. It will be economic and political poison, because the worst thing you can now get is that the EU27 show that they are not able to agree on the MFF, are not able to agree on the recovery plan. That would be sending a very negative signal, which will have negative impact on the economies and thus also on politics, because the economy will, if it worsens, will obviously have a negative effect also on politics over time.
Okay, so not disastrous if they don't do it next week. Maybe an element here of managing expectations also for public opinion, because what you don't want at this stage is for countries like Italy, already feeling let down by the EU, to feel that they've had another slap in the face. So the degree to which this is expectation management or a realistically pessimistic view remains to be seen. But watch out for that negotiating box, and we will be back. We are going to change the time of the next weekly update. Given what Janis was just saying about how this might run into the weekend, we are going to shift next Friday's update to the following Monday, the 20th, so that we can bring you full analysis of whatever has happened over the course of however many days it might take. So, if you have any questions for Janis on that issue, please do save them for now or begin putting them in the question box in writing, and we'll come back to that a bit later on. But I wanted to move on now and bring in our special guest, Heather Grabbe, who is going to join us to talk about populism and the rule of law. And of course, this Janis mentioned this question of the link between the rule of law debate and the budget and the MFF argument, the conditionality argument. We'll come back to that element of it later on. But I wanted to start with the rule of law issue, Heather, and really, I think, start by assessing where we are. What impact has COVID had? This is, of course, a long-running and vexed issue for the EU. How do you deal with countries that don't respect the EU's fundamental values? Germany's made it one of their 5 priorities for the presidency. Some people might say, why do that now? We have so many other issues, economic, social issues, and health issues, of course, above all else. Why does this matter now? And what has happened since the crisis began? What's your reading of it?
Well, there's the short term and there's the longer term. And I think the German presidency is seeing both of those as being at stake. And that's important in terms of providing leadership at this point in the EU's history. So short term, it's important to get back to normal in terms of democratic checks and balances, civil liberties, and other key fundamental freedoms. And what we've seen is that all governments have had to take emergency measures. That's normal in a crisis. All of us have had our civil liberties restricted during the confinement. Governments have had emergency powers, including emergency funding powers. All of this is normal. But the key thing is these things have to be time limited, there has to be parliamentary oversight, and there has to be a return to normal as soon as possible. And many of the governments, I'd say most of the EU governments, have been doing that. They haven't extended the emergency powers. And that's quite important because we have seen that in countries like, for example, France, after terrorist attacks. A different kind of crisis, but where emergency powers for the police stayed in place for a long time. So it's important that countries remove those, governments remove the powers for executives. But of course, we have seen other measures kept in place, notably in Hungary, where the government still can reimpose rule by decree anytime it likes and restrict parliamentary oversight. And of course, the criminalization in Hungary of spreading of fake news. The way it's worded is a bit complicated, but essentially the government decides on what that is, and it has been applied to people simply calling attention to failings in how the government is handling the crisis. That's very worrying because that has a chilling effect on the free press, and press freedom is an absolutely key part of freedom of expression, and it's vital to also to have a pluralistic debate in a society. So I think in the short term there are many of these issues will be resolved in most member states, but the German presidency is looking to the long term also in terms of thinking about how does the EU deal with problems with fundamental rights and rule of law going forward, because that's been very much lacking.
And just if I could follow up on that short-term point first, you talked about the restrictions that have been in place in many countries, and indeed Angela Merkel referred to this in her speech to Parliament this week when she said she found it difficult to impose restrictions coming from Eastern Europe, from East Germany. But this has also been used, the fact that everybody's been doing it, has been used particularly by Hungary, by Viktor Orban, to say, you're all at it. Everybody does it when they need to do it. Do you think what all member states have had to do during the crisis has undermined in any way their ability to tackle the issue where it's clearly using the pandemic as a pretext as opposed to doing what you need to do? You talked about that time limited, proportionate, and so on. Is there a sense in which this has somehow undermined the case of the 25 when they come to dealing with Hungary and Poland, or not?
It doesn't, as countries, as executives remove those emergency powers. The faster they do that, the less it undermines it. The danger is if some of them keep them in place in a way that isn't proportionate and time limited and so on. But I don't see that happening. On the whole, parliaments are very aware of the issue. The press in most member states is very alive to it as well. And I don't see that as, I think that's less of a problem with the pandemic than it has been with counter-terrorism measures in the past. Because the health authorities are, yes, there are different views on how to handle it. We've seen different responses, for example, in Sweden. But on the whole, there's a consensus that these things are necessary, but the population won't wear them. And neither will democracy wear them. So where democracy is still alive and kicking, it works well. The problem is in Hungary in particular, and let's see what happens with the Polish elections as well, where there have been progressive restrictions, and that those restrictions have got worse as a result of the crisis. And the fact that this is a member state of the EU has an effect.
Yeah, and just so that is, if you like, game playing, to say, don't you call us out because you're doing it too. But another area in which developments since the crisis began has been exploited, particularly again by Hungary, is the European Central Bank's ruling on the quantitative easing, the ruling of the German Constitutional Court on the ECB's quantitative easing program, which has been seized on again in Hungary to say, here is a possible route to challenge the primacy of EU law. We might just start doing the same sort of thing again. And then, Janis, I'll come to you. I just want to complete the picture. Is that game playing, or is that a more serious threat, do you think, to the primacy of EU law and to its ability to deal with this issue?
Well, the Karlsruhe ruling was a big shock to the German political establishment, and there's been a rather rapid move by the Bundestag to resolve the issue within Germany by setting up an accountability mechanism between the Bundesbank and the Bundestag in order to satisfy the Constitutional Court's concerns. But the ripple effect that it has in other member states is, as you point out, Jackie, that's more serious. Because in Germany, there is no serious questioning of the primacy of EU law by judges, by courts, and certainly not by the government. The federal election is going to be next year. Let's see how the debate moves. But the commitment to rule of law and to keeping the European Union united around its community of law is very deep. That's not necessarily the case elsewhere. And I think this is the key question. Will this be used, as some of the government ministers have suggested in Hungary, to question the primacy of EU law by referring, for example, cases that have been already decided by the European Court of Justice to the Hungarian Constitutional Court? That would set off a whole range of consequences for the single market, which, amongst other areas of EU policy and EU law, that should really give everybody in the EU cause for concern. The EU is fundamentally about the community of law. That's what holds us together. That's what makes the EU much more than a regional free trade agreement. It makes it much more than has been achieved by any other regional body across the world. It's what gives it its power. So if you start to undermine that by saying, well, we can pack our constitutional court with allies of the government and then decide that constitutional court rulings will take primacy over those of the European Court of Justice, then you start to lose the whole EU.
Absolutely. Janis, in terms of this decision of the German presidency to give it priority, come back on the specifics of the relationship between this and the budget negotiations later, but that broad decision, Angela Merkel told the European Parliament this week, this is one of the 5 key priorities, defending the fundamental values of the EU. Do you think the German presidency is right, in light of what has been happening and Heather has been describing, to give it that priority? And do you fear that COVID-19 has made the situation much worse, or merely kept us where we were, if you like, before the crisis began?
Well, first of all, I think it was the right thing to do. It is an issue of concern. It has been for a while. The COVID-19, by the way, has been an accelerator on many things, so it has also accelerated dangers related to the rule of law. So the fact that the German presidency has put that as one of the top priorities, and for those of us who listened to the speech of Angela Merkel, she was extremely highlighted. She was highlighting it more than most of us were even expecting. I think that's the right thing to do, because it's sending out a signal that this is an issue which is of significance with respect to everyone in the EU, as Heather was alluding to, with respect to the rule of law, giving the confinement, giving the restrictions on some basic fundamental rights over the past months. This has become an issue which is something which one has to have in mind wherever you are in the European Union, and probably also for a longer period of time. because we should always remember that we're still in an initial phase of the crisis. We do not know what the long-term consequences of it will be and how it will also affect issues related to the rule of law, to fundamental rights. Having said that, there's also politics linked to it. Listening to Angela Merkel very carefully, she was saying that because we have issues related to the rule of law, to basic rights, we need to do ABC. So she was making a link, a political link, arguing that if we want to make sure that those who are trying to push countries in a certain direction are not able to do so, we need to have an agreement on the MFF. We had to have an agreement on the recovery plan. If we don't have that agreement, we would then further play into the hands of those who want to push ourselves, our societies, into the wrong direction. So she was also making a political link between these things. With respect to the, just a word on the ruling of Karlsruhe, which clearly was a not very wise, smart ruling. Plus, it also had deficits in legal and in technical economic terms, in terms of how it was arguing. The reaction to it was very strong. Heather was already alluding to the reaction in Germany, a lot of criticism from lawyers, from economists, saying that the arguments raised were not going in the right direction. A harsh criticism vis-a-vis Karlsruhe, which I at least have not heard on many other rulings. Karlsruhe, the German Constitutional Court, is enjoying a lot of trust throughout Germany, but with respect to this ruling, the criticism was very strong, also from representatives of government, but also the European Court of Justice, the ECB. They all reacted, I think, in a smart way, and they showcased that this was a wrong thing to do. And I think this was also a strong signal to all those who might want to misuse the ruling of the German Constitutional Court in order to argue, look, if the German Constitutional Court can say we are not accepting a ruling, we can also do that with respect to other rulings. So the reaction to it, I think, might even have the contrary effect, signaling that no, you cannot do the things you might want to do in terms of undermining the rule of law and basic fundamental rights.
So they tried to plug that gap immediately and not leave that possibility open. Heather, in terms of, as we've talked about, this is not a new problem, exacerbated by COVID-19, but not a new problem. In your assessment, how effective was the EU in terms of the responses it was developing, rule of law mechanism, an annual report on the rule of law and so on? How effective do you think, was it on the right track to deal with this before COVID-19 began? And how would you assess the way it's responded? And I'm thinking here particularly of, for example, that letter that was signed by many member states very early on in the crisis about all the points you mentioned, that any restrictions on civil liberties and so on must be proportional and time limited. Didn't mention Hungary. So Viktor Orban then rather cheekily signed up to the letter, as if it wasn't about him at all. So I'm just wondering, before we talk about what they're going to do next, my sense is nothing the EU has done until now seems to have had any impact on behaviour in Hungary or Poland. And certainly since the crisis, the EU has not had an impact. Am I being fair or am I being overly critical?
Well, this is a really tricky area because it's new territory for the EU. There's been a huge squeamishness since the start of European integration about domestic politics and particularly about things that go wrong with democracy, and that will then include rule of law and values and rights within member states. Think back to Silvio Berlusconi attacking judges in Italy, corruption, all kinds of problems in the 1990s, and the member states were very reluctant to get involved. The first time they reacted was, of course, in 1999 when Schussel invited Haider to join the Austrian government, and then things started to move. Then they started to look at using Article 7. This slowly began to take form, but there's still no acquis démocratique. There's still no real secondary law, a body of law to back up the values in Article 2, and of course to give substance to Article 7 in terms of what are the standards met. And you'll hear, for example, the Hungarian ambassador to the EU, the permanent representative, say very frequently, well, the standards haven't really been set, it's all really quite ambiguous. And he has a point there. It's been very difficult, and because the EU has tended to outsource issues of constitutional misuse, for example, to the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe to ask for external bodies to provide standards and guidance on these issues because there is no acquis. So we're having to live with a situation where the legal instruments in terms of defining what is rule of law, defining standards of democratic behavior and respect for fundamental rights are not adequate. However, having said that, there's a lot more the EU could have done much earlier on. Fidesz came back into power in 2010 and started with media laws and a whole set of laws over the past decade, which have progressively restricted press freedom, progressively restricted the whole scope for civil society to be active. We had most recently the NGO laws. And the EU level, both the Commission and also the Council especially, were very, very slow to react. Now things have started moving. In the past years, we saw under the last Commission, now continued more strongly with this Commission, I think, the issuance of infringement proceedings, which the Commission has won in all of its cases so far. So these values-based infringement proceedings have been very important. And the Court of Justice, just a couple of weeks ago, reaffirmed very clearly that the space for civil society to act and for freedom of association is essential for pluralism in a democracy. So there's a jurisprudence which is now growing thanks to these values-based infringements, which is a very important set of tools that the EU can use in the future. The problem is political now, because the Council remains extremely ambiguous about it, because it's really squeamish about criticizing one of its own. There's a sort of gentleman's club aspect to the Council, where prime ministers and presidents don't like criticizing their fellows, which is why peer review is a problematic way of trying to do it. I think the Commission is trying to do its best to get together lots of evidence and independent evaluations for the rule of law report that it will issue this autumn. And I think we can expect that to be more hard-hitting and have more specific recommendations in it than the corruption report, very ill-fated, that died in the last Commission. But nonetheless, the Commission is still a body that is, in my view, overly politicized because of the Spitzenkandidat system and so on. I myself would prefer to see an independent assessment undertaken by an independent body on which then the Council could decide on action. But so be it, here we are with a peer review led by the Commission's report. Let's see the Council now take action on it, because the Member States have got to understand that where Hungary goes now, others will follow. There will be a ripple effect in other Member States, and then it's very hard to defend the rule of law and fundamental values.
But as you say, that squeamishness coming from, in part, a gentleman's club, we don't criticize each other, but also if we criticize them and take action against them, one day it may be our turn. Yes. So a complicated issue to be dealt with at that level. Janis, and then if anybody has any questions, please do bring them in, and then we'll turn to the future. But your assessment of the difficulties, the political difficulties that Heather was talking about, that the EU has faced, and do you think the Commission at least has been on the right track? Again, the Commission didn't name Hungary specifically when it talked about the principles that you had to abide by in imposing restrictions under COVID-19. Again, very careful not to get into that territory. So less squeamishness, I think Heather was suggesting, but still at that highest level, a degree of nervousness about calling it out, if you like.
Well, I think the key word which Heather mentioned is politics. It's political. The ability from the outside to deal with a situation within individual member states where certain governments are pushing their countries in a negative direction with respect to the rule of law, as we've seen in the Hungarian case, for example, is limited. And I think we need to all be aware that the ability of the EU, the ability of the Commission are limited. Heather was already referring to Article 7, the rule of law mechanism. However, I think that over the past 5 years roughly, we have learned to better cope with the politics of this. We have learned not to make as many mistakes as we've done in the past, not to play into the hands of those like Orban and others who say, look, they're coming from the outside, they're undermining the sovereign, which is you, the citizens who have voted this government, in its ability to act, to politically act, and they're using this as an argument. So if they're using this as an argument, you also need to, when reacting from the outside, take that into account. smartly take that into account. We've seen in certain instances some years ago where representatives of governments were making remarks, which at the end of the day, I remember also German representatives of governments making remarks with respect to certain developments in certain countries, where the given governments, heads of government, were using it as an argument to say, look, now Berlin is again dictating what we need to be doing, making also some historical remarks linked to that. And I think that stopped a bit, and you had more Brussels representatives of the Commission, Timmermans in the last Commission being the one who was the voice, who was saying there are things moving in the wrong direction, who was criticizing some of the developments. And I think what was also key was that we were using the infringement proceedings. And whatever results there were from the European Court of Justice rulings, member states, these governments were respecting them. So it has been working up till now. So that was politically a smart thing to do. And I think we need to continue dealing with this in a very political and smart political way. And the fact that and I think one needs to mention it, that the European People's Party has committed some mistakes over the past years, and the way how it has handled the question of Fidesz, the question of Orban being part of the EPP, the way how that has been handled, I think has been something which has been giving wrong signals. And I think that everyone needs to reconsider as to mistakes which have been committed in the past should at least lead to better maneuvering in future.
Okay, before we move on to broader questions of populism, I just want to come back to this point, and Janis, perhaps this time turn to you first on the link with the MFF and the recovery plan. And you mentioned it earlier, there is this proposal to have a very strong link, so you don't get the EU funds if you breach egregiously rule of law or fundamental values, but this is coming under a lot of pressure. You said that Angela Merkel in the Parliament put much more emphasis on the fundamental values issue than many people expected, but will she stick to that if it looks as if we could get a deal, that vital deal that we so need to respond to the COVID crisis, if the sticking point becomes this rule of law conditionality? Do you think she will stick to it, or do you think she'll be prepared to jettison it? We've seen MEPs in their debate on this issue only yesterday expressing fears that Germany might be willing to give this away as a price for a deal. Is that your expectation as well? How do you read the politics in Berlin on this? And then come to you again, Heather.
Well, giving away is a big way of characterizing it. I think the question is, to what degree will there be a link between rule of law conditionality and the MFF, and how practical will that link be when then the new MFF and the recovery plan will have to be implemented? And here, with respect to the latter, I have my doubts, because what now is priority number one is to get an agreement on the MFF, to get an agreement on the recovery plan. And as we all know, for that agreement, you need consensus. You need the agreement of all member states, of all governments, including those who fear that any kind of rule of law conditionality might be used against them in the immediate future. And we've had that problem even before COVID-19. I think now that challenge is even bigger, of linking rule of law conditionality and a new MFF, and now the new recovery plan. And in Berlin, by the way, you have also different fractions. You have, it's not a black box. You have the Foreign Ministry, which has been among the most vocal in arguing that the rule of law is of particular significance and that there should be a strong link to the MFF and to the recovery plan. Whereas in the Finance Ministry, I think the priority number one is to get a deal on the MFF, on the recovery plan. And I think that when you listen very carefully to Angela Merkel in the Parliament, and also the way she responded to some of the questions that were directed to her by MEPs, it became clear that she also has a top priority, which is let's get this over in terms of getting a deal on the MFF.
Absolutely.
So there will be a link to conditionality, but I don't think that it will be strong, and I doubt that it will be actually practical when then the deal will have to be implemented with respect to the MFF and the recovery.
Yeah, she did say at one point in that debate in the Parliament, it's not just a money issue, it's an overarching theme that will run through the years, maybe a hint there. there to what you're suggesting. But Heather, your predictions, if you have any, about how the politics of this will play out and the link with the budget. And also, I don't know whether you could comment on Renew Europe group in the Parliament, came up with a suggestion for what they called smart conditionality. So if we want to punish a government that is in breach of fundamental values, we mustn't punish the citizens, we mustn't punish NGOs, we mustn't punish society. So we would have smart conditionality and make sure then the Commission would directly give that money to those organisations. Is that a runner? Is it at all possible, if indeed a desirable and laudable aim?
Well, the conditions and the rules on use of EU money are pretty complicated, and it's very difficult to change them because of the need for agreement. And even where there's qualified majority vote on particular, application, it's still quite tricky. But I think conditionality is absolutely the way to go for two reasons. One is because it's absolutely vital that the EU doesn't miss this chance to put teeth into its commitment to rule of law and values, and the teeth lie in the wallet. If they don't manage to put conditions on use of EU money at this point, then they're setting themselves up for all kinds of problems in the future. For one thing, ineffective instruments to prevent member states from abusing their own democracies and rule of law, but also on abuse of EU money. The biggest scandals that are going to take place around the EU budget will be in, for example, Germany and the Netherlands and the frugal countries, if taxpayers feel that their money is being squandered through corruption by ruling parties in other member states. That's going to make them much more unwilling in future to see more transfers to the EU budget or through other kinds of funds. And if we've learned nothing from the past decade, it's that taxpayers want to see that EU money is used well. So conditions are a way of bringing the frugals on board. Also, frankly, there need to be conditions on green transition and other things that voters can see are going to be very necessary. But that's beyond our discussion today. But I think that's also really vital, and that could be the sweet spot between the frugals, actually, and the deal is to say, look, this conditionality will make sure the money is spent well. It's not squandered, and it's spent on making the transition that is going to be vital to prevent climate change. But the key thing is that the conditions relate both to corruption, so preventing misuse of funds, which is important, and that's where the smart conditionality is important, because the money is often being wasted by national governments, and so the idea of being able to ensure that the end beneficiaries, including municipalities, spend it well, that's an intelligent way forward. Because it's easier to monitor that than through big government contracts where we can see the corruption, we can see the number of OLAF investigations and the investigative journalism that has revealed massive fraud in spending of the common agricultural policy, for example, in Hungary. But in addition to misuse of funds, this question of the generalized deficiencies in the administration of the funds is vital, because that relates to the institutional safeguards that make sure that the governance of the country is making sure that public money is spent well. So, for example, the independence of the judiciary in prosecuting misuse of funds. For example, the freedom of the press in exposing misuse of funds. So these generalized deficiencies need to look at these broader questions of rule of law, values, and the essential underpinning of democracy in freedom of association, freedom of the press, and so on. And that needs to be there in the conditionality too.
Thank you very much. Let us move, and we have a question in this relation to populism and the connection between these two discussions. Andreas Andoudiniakis, and I'm sure I have mispronounced your name, Andreas, apologies, says populists in the EU have been relatively quiet during the crisis, but the recovery period could be an opportunity for them to capitalise on slow growth and popular indignation. This could stifle movements that sparked before the crisis, such as climate activism in the EU. What do you expect to happen? Is the crisis and eventual recovery going to bring new momentum to xenophobic populism in the EU? So a fairly broad, let's break that down a little bit in terms of, so far, have the populists, Janis, had a good crisis or a bad crisis? And do you agree with the suggestion from the questioner here that maybe their moment of opportunity is coming as the economics of all of this begin to bite hard?
Well, first of all, I think that we've seen that some have been cheering, that populists have not done well. And if you look throughout Europe, but also especially outside Europe, you have a number of cases where populists are struggling with respect to COVID-19, whether it's Trump, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Boris Johnson. There's a long list of those populists who are also in power who are struggling because they are in denial of the actual COVID-19 crisis. And by being in denial, they're taking decisions which at the end of the day is worsening the situation, and that's playing against them, and citizens are critical of how they have been not able to manage the crisis. However, there are some who have been cheering, I think, too early, saying, look, populists are struggling. We see that the executive, mainstream executive, is better in dealing, many of them, with the crisis, even in countries which have been hit hard by the crisis. They have eventually been able to tackle the problem. So there are a lot who are arguing, look, situation doesn't look as bad, and the mainstream might even be able to profit. I think that is premature and it is dangerous because populism, authoritarian and liberal populism, is an expression of more deep-rooted challenges which we're all facing in terms of our societies. I think there are two. One is the multiple insecurities which people are feeling, and the second is the increasing polarization within our societies. And COVID-19 has the potential, as it develops, as the consequences of COVID-19 become even clearer over the upcoming months, maybe years, has the potential to increase the insecurities which people feel, the socioeconomic insecurities which people are fearing, but also maybe identity fears. If you look back into the so-called migration refugee crisis, there were identity fears which people were feeling. So there are multiple insecurities which people feel, and COVID-19 might intensify that. And in terms of polarization, we're already seeing that in different member states. Are we having discussions within national societies as to how to react to COVID-19, as to what governments have gone too far. We even have all these speculation about who is behind it, and conspiracy theories thriving in many member states. So there is an increasing divisions also within our societies, and the COVID-19 crisis might play into both these directions and play into the hand of the authoritarian liberal populists. So the verdict is still out as to whether they will, at the end of the day, profit or not. But to cheer prematurely would be wrong.
And it sounded a little bit as Angela Merkel was cheering prematurely this week in the parliament, because she said you cannot fight the pandemic with lies and disinformation. The limits of populism are being laid bare. And Heather, so are you more with the Angela Merkel, we're finding out just what they're really like and it doesn't work, or more with Janis's analysis that their moment is yet to come because, as he says, insecurities and polarization, that is the ground upon which they thrive? Where do you sit on where we are now?
Well, the key thing to remember is that in any kind of crisis like this, incumbent governments of all kinds gain support. People turn to the government and to leadership. They want leadership in a moment of huge fear and uncertainty. And so if you look at the opinion polls across the world, incumbent governments do well, whether they're populist or not populist, in fact. And the key thing is, what competence do they show during the crisis? So Merkel is right that if they can show that they're making a competent job of it, then they're going to stay in power for longer. And ones that are showing themselves to be incompetent, unable to handle the crisis, things are getting worse, like we see in the United States, and also, you know, where what they said at the beginning of the crisis, for example, think about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil saying, oh, it's just a little cold, no problem. Now he's tested positive. Now we see huge problems for the Brazilian healthcare system. Then populists do come a cropper. But the problem is that even if incumbents handle the crisis well, populists still increase xenophobia, and that was there in the question originally posed, because we can see xenophobia has still gone up. Look at how migrants have been scapegoated as spreaders of disease, apparently from various populists. Look at how the Roma have been treated, with many of them treated much worse during this crisis. So even if populist governance is not popular during a crisis, xenophobia can still increase. And of course, closing of borders is necessary, but then that can become an excuse for keeping them closed and for closing down the society. And we have to think longer term about how anti-establishment movements of all kinds will react to this crisis. It's really important that leaders start to explain to the public that this is the first of many crises. that we need much more resilient governance systems in place, because this is just the first pandemic. Think about what will happen with climate change and what you see in most of the risk scenarios that even the private sector is putting forward, government ministries are putting forward, defense ministries are putting forward now, where they are expecting climate change to bring many more crises of insect-borne diseases, as mosquitoes spread north, for example, rising sea levels, or extreme weather events, extreme heat waves in the summer. All of these things are going to test democratic infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, and now is the moment to bolster it for resilience. So if you can make that case to the public and explain that we need good governance put in place now, we've got to make this work, we can't have short-term fixes, we can't simply dismiss the future events that are coming, that's really dangerous, because that allows the populists to simply say, well, tear down the institutions and everything will be okay.
Okay, I want to come back to you, Janis, in a moment on that point of what can be done in order to counter the populists as they seek to exploit this moment we've been talking about, and get your reaction to Heather's suggestion there. But let me first go to the floor and give the floor to John Palmer. John, you are self-muted. I can't unmute you at the moment. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, hang on, you've disappeared. If you still want to ask a question, John, can you put your hand up again, because for some reason you have vanished. But while I wait to see if, there we are, let me try once more. For some reason today, I don't seem, you're self-muted according to, I don't know whether anyone in the background, technical wizards can help, but while we try to solve that problem, Janis, your sense of what we need to do, and Heather very much putting the emphasis there on the governance aspect, the competence issue, and tackling that. What about the other aspects as well? I mean, the exploitation of a sense of unfairness, of social malaise as the economic crisis deepens. Is that also, is it how that is addressed? Is that going to be equally crucial, or do you think the governance will be absolutely central?
No, I think that governance questions are essential. They have been essential. So the quality of governance is going to be key, and it has been key. Having said that, another issue which will be definitely determining as to whether populists might or might not thrive, might or might not profit from the COVID-19 crisis, is how the crisis itself will develop. So if the crisis from in 1 year's time has led to, to socioeconomic deterioration within member states of a magnitude which now we're not able even to appreciate. We know that the Commission's latest figures say that we want to have -8% GDP loss in 2020, but it's saying that economically we will be doing much better in 2021. There will be a recovery. Who's to say that that will be the case? If this would not be the case, it will be playing into the hands of those who will be arguing, look, those who are in power, because Heather was correctly saying that those who have been in power, the executives, have profited up till now, but they might then be arguing, look, in the beginning, they might have been able to deal with the crisis, but eventually the situation deteriorated, and they have not been able to cope with the socioeconomic conditions. They also have not been able to cope maybe with the health conditions. If there's a second or a third wave, then they would obviously profit from that. So the ability to, in concrete terms, counter the effects of the COVID-19 crisis is going to be key. And by the way, this is how I understood Angela Merkel, because she was indicating in her speech, we need to get this thing right, also at the European level. She was mostly referring to the European level, although there's a strong national dimension to getting things right. She was saying, if we don't get this thing right, we're going to be playing exactly into the hands of the populists, who will be trying to exploit that situation at that point in time. So we collectively, she was referring to all the EU27, to the heads of state and government. She was also referring to the European Parliament she was addressing. We collectively have to find an agreement. We need to get things moving now in order to showcase that we're able to react to the crisis, especially after, in the beginning of COVID-19 crisis, there was a lot of chaos, and that there was an impression which was created that there was a lack of solidarity. Remember all the negative criticism in Italy. So if you don't get an agreement now at the European level, all those who want exactly that to happen, you'll exploit that weakness. So I think there is a strong link. yes, with governance, but there's also strong links with delivery, and you need to deliver both at the European and at the national level.
Thank you. Helen, I'll give you a chance to react at the moment. I think I can bring John in, so let me see if I can do it now. John, you have the mic.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you beautifully now. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Thank you anyway. I'd like just to return, if I may, to the prospects for the European Council and ask, there are two sort of straws in the wind, one could argue. One is the growing international global opinion of global institutions, IMF, OECD, etc., adding to the severity of their warnings about a collapse in employment and a dramatic drop in production. That presumably plays one way in terms of the argument about EU policy. The other, though, is the result of the election for the presidency of the Euro area finance ministers, where the Spanish minister, strongly backed by Germany and France, was defeated. I wondered whether the panel, Janis in particular, thought either of these might play a significant role in the next few days.
Thank you. Yes, and Janis, what do we read into the victory against expectations of the Irish candidate over the Spanish candidate? Thank you, John.
Yes, with respect to the growing international warnings, yes, that plays into the equation because it signals that actually what we're going to experience in terms of the economic consequences of this crisis is going to be severe. The OECD's figures with respect to unemployment are really signaling this is a severe crisis and the effects of it will still be shown. So it enhances those who argue you need to have a rather swift agreement during the summer on a package which is worthwhile having. So I think it is actually underlying all those positions who are arguing in this direction. With respect to the president of the Eurogroup, I wouldn't exaggerate. I think at the end of the day, which made the difference was the fact that Donoghue comes from a smaller country. And that it's not a representative of a bigger member state, and Spain is a bigger member state. I think that was a key argument which made the difference. Which, by the way, at the end of the day, could have also gone the other way around. It was a very, very, very close vote. But there were some things which the Spanish finance ministers probably did wrong if she had in mind to become president of the Eurogroup over the past months, the past year. She had positioned herself negatively vis-a-vis the Hanseatic League. She had reacted to a position the Hanseatic League had taken by saying this is a group of smaller countries. I think that didn't play well in making sure that she will get the vote of one or the other, which she would have needed in order to get a majority in the Eurogroup. So I think this is more...
a fascinating insight into the complexities of an EU of 27. In a smaller EU, it used to be that if the big member states got together and decided that's our man or woman, it was done deal. This is a much more complex world, the fight back of the smalls. But Heather, coming back to the broader populism question, if we might, just before we close, and this point that Janis was making about delivery, and delivery in the context of those global warnings about just how bad this is going to be. How important for you, and how important is the narrative that goes with that delivery? What is the way that politicians should be talking about what happens next and their efforts to shore up the economy, to mitigate the damage? How do they get the narrative right in order to have the best chance of countering those populist arguments you were talking about earlier?
I think it's about more than narrative. Narrative is the first step, and they need to substantiate the slogan, build back better, by saying what exactly that means in policy terms. And they need to learn the lessons after 2008 and the austerity that followed that. Because a lot of what populists have reaped, what they have really benefited from politically, is the injustices and inequalities that are very clear in European societies. There are so many people who feel left behind one way or another. There's a general feeling that that states are not actually trying to address the issue of economic inequality and also social injustice. So they now need to put meat on the bones of that slogan and make make it something real. And I think that can be helped very much at EU level. A lot of this has to happen at national level, it needs to be funded at national level and so on. But look at how there is now a huge appetite for a much stronger state. For the era of neoliberalism and the idea of leaving everything to the market has come to an end. There's much more attention to inequality thanks to Thomas Piketty and so on. There's also much more interest in what can the state do to protect people. L'Europe qui protège is also about protecting people from the vagaries of the economic cycle, from pandemics, and of course from future disasters, from climate change. Now, if the state is going to be able to deliver the right kind of protection, it needs to start looking at policies that address social injustices. For example, the injustices caused by structural racism. We've seen the protests in Europe in recent weeks following the death of George Floyd in the United States. The pleas of Europeans, not just Europeans from ethnic minorities, but from all classes and ethnicities, to address these structural injustices is really great. And more politicians need to come out strongly and show how they're going to do that, also through economic policy. This is about housing, employment, education, health. And so we can't keep just calling for European unity. Yes, that's important, but we need to have a plan across Europe for delivering a fair climate transition, which also includes more economic equality and social justice. And this is just as important for the centre-right as it is for the centre-left. There's a more paternalistic idea of the state, for example, from the CDU, which could well come back in the German federal election next year, and it's about time it does.
So I was going to ask you to give me one priority for action in order to address this, but I think your answer would be can't do that. The good governance and the other side. But is there one thing you would particularly identify? And same question to you, Janis, and then we close.
I think fairer Europe has got to be a really important part of the narrative, that Europe that protects, yes, but Europe that is fair and which delivers fairness to all citizens. Fairness in the sense of what you experience before the courts, rule of law, issues like that, but also fairness in terms of the burden of adjustment for the big changes that are to come thanks to digitization and climate will not fall unfairly on households, on consumers, and on the poor. There needs to be a much broader frame, lifting up the eyes of politicians to the horizon and thinking about what comes next, because the immediate firefighting is distracting, is absorbing a huge amount of attention and of course money, which needs to be spent on building up the longer term.
And indeed, you know, people saying now, well, governments always told us there wasn't enough money to do these things, to have a fairer Europe, and then when needed, there was enough money. There isn't, or you can borrow those levels. So it sort of changes the nature of the debate, as you were indicating earlier. Janis, for you, is there for you one central priority in order to address these issues most effectively? Is it that fairer Europe, both in delivery terms and in narrative terms?
Well, first of all, at the European level, I think what we're now seeing and what now is priority number one with respect to the MFF and the recovery plan is important, but it's only going to be one thing. There's much more which will have to be done even after that compromise, that consensus will have been found. So firefighting will continue for a while. Now, if I take a step back, for me, the one thing is not what you do, but the one thing is what's the principle you adhere to. And I think it's honesty. It's honesty in terms of explaining what the situation is like, what potentially the consequences of COVID-19 might look like in the upcoming months, maybe in the upcoming years, with respect to all the different dimensions of the crisis. And it is a multi-dimensional crisis we're facing. It's not only the economy, it's not only health, it's societal, it's geopolitics, it's geoeconomic, it's a lot of different dimensions. You need to be honest about actually what the degree of the challenge looks like. And that's something which Heather was alluding towards earlier, it is part of a series of different crises. What we're facing now with COVID-19 is part of what we had over the past 10 years called the polycrisis at the European level. This is another phase of the polycrisis, and more will come afterwards, which means that you need to strengthen the ability of member states and the ability collectively of the EU to be able to deal with these crises, and there will be more which will be coming. So that's where things like sovereignty, where things like the ability to counter the concrete challenges and the ability to be resilient in view of all these crises comes in.
Okay. And on that note, the audience can't join me in thanking you in this virtual world, but thank you so much. Thank you to Janis, but particularly thank you to Heather. It was great to have you with us. It was great. It's great to have your expertise on our strategic council. So thank you so much for that. Just before we close, just to draw your attention to some of a host of events next week. The EPC is keeping busy right up to the summer break. On Monday, an EPC event co-organised with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a dialogue on what can the German presidency do for a post-COVID-19 Europe. On Tuesday, the Green Deal. Haven't talked about it so much today, but it was inherent in a lot of what we're talking about there at the end. The Green Deal, a basis for recovery. That's a discussion with the European Commission Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. On Wednesday, an event on the EU-China strategic partnership. And on Thursday, an issue we haven't had time to talk about during the weekly update, but being debated and resonating right across Europe and the world. Black Lives Matter, Europe's anti-racism moment is the question. And as I mentioned before, because of next week's summit, we won't be joining you on Friday as usual, but on Monday morning, June the 20th, bright and early, to give you, we hope, a full analysis of the outcome of those negotiations and where we stand after what may be round one or maybe the end. Just also before we go, publications again, a torrent of publications before the summer break. One, a commentary on the EU budget and the summit next week. One on the link between the digital and sustainable transitions. Another on different possible Brexit scenarios, one of our favourite topics here on the weekly update. Another on how can the EU strengthen its public health responses to pandemics, and going back to an issue we discussed a couple of weeks ago, the conference on the future of Europe. So lots to come before we break. Thank you so much for joining us for this Friday update. Thank you again so much to Heather. Thank you, Janis. We'll see you on the 20th. And in the meantime, have a good weekend and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, pleasure.